Hello, today is Tuesday, 28th February 2023, and this is Nadia Kuslima, and I'm here today with Jana Howlett. Thank you for being here, Jana. Can you tell us
My
your
name is Jana.
Jana? Oh my goodness.
Don't worry. You're not the only one who pronounces it like that.
Oh no. Thank you for being here, Jana. Can you tell us your name and where you're from?
Okay, so my name is Jana Howlett.
Mhm.
I was born in Czechoslovakia, and which doesn't exist anymore. um, and I was 12 years old when we first left Czechoslovakia to go to China, where I was until I was 16. And then I came to England. And uh, I'm kind of fairly typical of Eastern Europeans, but also untypical
Mhm.
because my father was half Czech and half Polish, and my mother half English and half Swiss.
Wow. Okay.
And they met during the war
Mhm.
here, where my father had been in the Czech government in exile, which you probably won't have heard of, but
Mhm.
it basically after 38 and it became obvious what was going to happen, and especially after the invasion by the Germans
Yeah.
of Sudetenland, a number of Czechs left, and obviously all members of the government who didn't want to work with the Germans came to England.
All right.
Well, actually, no. It was more complicated, and it's related to the whole history of the Cold War. I
Mhm.
better actually tell you that I'm a historian, so it's kind of I'm not a you know I've thought about it not just because of my experience, but because of things I am interested in. So basically, those Czechs who were exiled or who left, like my dad, they could either go to the West, to England. And in those days, thank God, England was relatively liberal about accepting immigrants from other countries, or they could go to Moscow. A number of them did go to Moscow.
Right.
And this was very important from the point of view of the Cold War
Mhm.
because of what happened after the war.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, is that enough about my background?
Yeah, that's a good start. So if your dad was in exile and then he ended up in Czechoslovakia, or
Mm-hmm.
how did that? Okay.
No, my dad, who was Czech,
Yes.
ended up in England.
All right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he left for England. Two of his other brothers also left because he was Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
So of the family, there were 12 kids, and only three survived the war by emigrating. The rest died, as far as I know, because I don't know enough about the history of that history. So two of the brothers went eventually to America, and my father stayed in England.
Okay.
And he, by then, he was an engineer by education.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not entirely sure what he did. On the marriage certificate with my mother, it says that he's an administrator. Um, and they met because my mother was working at the Swiss legation in London, and they must have met at some party or other. Anyway, so they married. Um, and they were presumably, they were obviously in London during the war. I don't actually know when exactly he came to London again, because I only know that they got married about 44, something like that.
Okay.
Uh, and then in 1945, when the war finished, my father said he wanted to go back home. So he did. And
Mm-hmm.
he worked for the Czech government in Czechoslovakia when he returned. And my mother, because I later asked her about it. My father was 25 years older than my mother. So my mother was only 26 years old when she had to make the decision as to whether she was going to leave England or not.
Yeah.
And she came from a very different background from my father.
Mm.
And basically, I think there were two things at play. One of them was that, she'd had a very, how can I say, privileged childhood and upbringing. Privileged in some ways, not in others, because she lost her mother when she was very young. But she was used to traveling. She was trilingual. And she, I think, from what she said, the war for her, the worst thing was that she couldn't travel anywhere, that she was stuck in England.
Mm.
And so in a sense, I think for her, both marrying my father and going to Czechoslovakia was kind of, it was an adventure. Nobody really, in those days knew much about Eastern Europe, except that which they knew, because it was the first country, that had been betrayed, so to speak, by the West, because of the Munich Agreement. So she was sort of, I think there was a part of her which felt that, it's a country that deserve support, etc., and that my dad deserves support. And I think also, from what she said, she was kind of part of her sort of revolt against her background and her parents and, all of that. Because her family was a very, I don't know how good you are on religion, but that her family were Zwingliites, which was kind of more extreme than Lutheranism. So, yeah. And of course, they disapproved hugely of the fact that she was marrying somebody, who was not wealthy and who was of a different, well, my dad didn't have a religion, but he was not certainly. But my mother had, in the meantime, converted to Catholicism as part of the reaction against her parents.
Wow.
So, the reason I tell you all of this is because, as you can imagine, she thought she had lots of experience and that she was sort of mature enough to deal with what she was going to deal with. But of course, she had no idea what she was going to have to face.
Right.
Yeah. And many, many years later, luckily, I was able to ask her questions about it. And I remember saying to her on one occasion, why didn't you, take me home again? Why did you stay in Czechoslovakia? Because, of course, the Cold War, from the point of view of my parents, was quite traumatic at times. And she said, because she herself had such a, mobile childhood between England and Switzerland and was trilingual, she said, I didn't want you to lose, your country. And, you, as far as I was concerned, Czechoslovakia was your country and it would have been displacing you again and that kind of thing. So I think that was part of it, but part of it was that she didn't want to admit to her parents that she'd made a mistake.
Right.
I strongly suspect that was part of it.
That's very interesting. And given that your parents, besides the big age gap, had these very different backgrounds, how did your interactions with, I guess, either one of them affect your understanding of the Cold War, like when you were a teenager?
To be honest, when you live in that world, you really don't actually think about anything much. Again, one of the things that, your teachers will know is, so as you may or may not know, many of the countries of Eastern Europe went over to the communist side. So in Czechoslovakia, there were elections in 1948, as a result of which the communists came to power. There's still a great deal of discussion as to whether this was, so to speak, legal or fixed. I would say that actually it was, that at that point, the progressive parties had much more support because they were seen as the only ones who had opposed the German invasion, and many of the more right-wing groups had cooperated and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it was partly because of that, and it was partly because, I suppose, the Soviet Union the armies had liberated Czechoslovakia. Uh, that's how people felt at the time, for most part. So it was also, that kind of sense of, maybe this will mean that there will be an end to war. We don't want to have any more sort of civil kind of it was a combination of things, but the communist line was, you're going to have greater prosperity and you're going to have peace.
Yeah.
And it was the capitalists who started the war, but we're against war. That was the kind of line. So I think that's why a lot of people supported it, including my father, who was working in the new government.
Right.
And then in 1953, I think it is, but the weird thing is because I was too small. I was born, I had no idea. I knew I was kind of weird by comparison with some of my friends, because my mother spoke to me in English, my father spoke to me in Czech, and they spoke to each other in German because that was their common language.
Oh, wow.
So I was brought up in a family where, three languages were normal, because my dad was that old. He was born into Austro-Hungary. And in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, German was the language of education if you wanted to get anywhere. So my dad spoke absolutely fluent German. Eventually, my mother spoke Czech, but not very well, ever. It was quite funny because she was a very good linguist, but I think kind of almost like subconsciously, she was resisting being Czech by not speaking the language properly. Which used to embarrass me at school. So it was kind of unusual, but it got worse partly because within the Czech Communist Party, and by the way, this is very common in all of Eastern Europe, so it happened in Hungary, it happened in Germany, and can't remember, and it happened in Poland. You had a split within the Communist Party between the pro-Soviet side and the pro-Western side.
Right.
And the pro-Soviet side were very kind of like, supporting everything that was happening in the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union, as you have very complicated things happening, but the main one being that I think the government is very aware that a large part of the population had kind of gone out of Russia for the first time in their lives, so they'd gone to Germany and so on. And people would say, how is it possible that this country which we've defeated, people are better off than we are, and generally Europe was seen for so many of them as a revelation in terms of, if communism is that much better and, we're supposed to be achieving all these economic miracles. So how come, we don't see the results of it so much? So there was this kind of, a little bit like, I would argue, a little bit like what's happening now, is that the government is desperate to stay in power. So you have, in a way, the war was a period of a little bit of, how could I say, liberalization. For example, towards the church, it was, churches opened, priests were allowed. Again, religious education was not persecuted, things like that. And you had, in films, you had references to religion and so on. After the war, it all kind of goes back to where pure Marxists, we're pure communists, we don't allow this, this, and this. And in addition to that, there is this, with the beginning of the Cold War, there is a huge kind of campaign against what was called, anti-Westernism.
Yeah.
And part of that campaign was very serious anti-Semitism. And I'm not going to go into that because it's too complicated. Russia had never been anything but anti-Semitic. I mean, it was the case during the Empire. But there was a very sort of short period when technically, all nations were equal and, everybody was going to have their own culture being allowed and so on. But from 1951, you get this really really serious attacks on minorities of all kinds, among, intellectuals and so on. And it's a period where people kind of start denouncing each other, much the same way as, to my horror, is happening now, but luckily less so in present day Soviet Russia than it was the case. And in Czechoslovakia, it resulted in something called the Slansky trials, where, Slansky.
Okay.
And my father, as a result of these, obviously, those people who had English wives, they were the most many of them were accused of spying for Britain or Israel or whatever, just anybody And so even though my parents had by then divorced, and my mother actually was going to marry somebody else who also was in the trials, and that guy, I'm afraid, got hanged. Luckily, my father was, just went into the mines. And because he was by training an engineer, he actually, not only, if you were really kind of in a bad situation, you would be sent to uranium mines. And many people died because of uranium. It was serious. But my dad was in the coal mines. And because he was an engineer, he was really, I gather, very much liked by his, by the people he worked with, because it was a mixture of, some were political prisoners, some were just prisoners, and some were just, ordinary miners. But the quality probably of kind of looking after them was lower than in many other places, because it was not, they did, so to speak, didn't deserve to be looked after because they had been criminals, so to speak, many of them. And I was sent to a school for children of prisoners for a year. So, and actually that was the first time I realized that I came, from a very unusual background, in the sense that, if I ever said things like I would be wearing different clothes, and I'd say, oh, well, that comes from England, and it's my grandpa sent it to me. And you could see that people sort of said, oh, well, she's a foreigner, and that kind of thing, even though I spoke perfectly, nobody could have told. And I was only 5 years old, but, even at that age, as you may know, if you're an outsider, you know it.
Yeah.
And so I kind of knew it. But at the same time, it's really hard to explain, because when I was sort of much older, when I was already in my late teens and I was in England, and people used to say to me, were you unhappy? And I'd say no. I mean, I had miserable bits of my childhood, but, you didn't know any other world, so it's not like I was hungry. It's not like, there were terrible, there were things happening within my family, but also my mother had friends. And so I was, apart from that 1 year, which was a nightmare, on the whole, my childhood was kind of very unstable. I mean, altogether in my life, I've been to 12 schools in 5 languages. So, yeah, it's a miracle I've got an education at all. But, in a funny kind of way, again, I can say that it probably made me stronger because of that, because you had to kind of, and also for some not weird reason, but, if you're multilingual or multicultural, if you're lucky, and I clearly was, people assume you're intelligent, So, it's kind of in a funny sort of way, at good times it worked for me. At bad times, obviously, not necessarily. But by the time I was old enough to be sort of starting to pass exams and things, it really worked for me quite well because I had a facility for learning.
Yeah.
So, when I was in Czechoslovakia, you kind of, for most people, everybody knew wouldn't call about the Cold War, but you kind of knew that there were two camps. One of the ways you knew it is because you couldn't travel anywhere, except in a few countries. Because you couldn't even travel to other countries of Eastern Europe, because some of them, like Yugoslavia, were considered too non-communist, too dangerous to know. Hungary was considered a little bit sort of dangerous, So Bulgaria, absolutely, everybody could go to Bulgaria because Bulgaria was entirely pro-Soviet, and on the whole, nobody worried that you might get the wrong kind of ideas there. And people knew very well, that you had to conform if you were to have a career. And, when I try and explain this to people, one of the things that is kind of difficult to explain unless you've had the experience, but in the West, up to a point, you also have to conform to certain kind of patterns. But the Eastern European system at its worst was constantly demanding confirmation, So you had meetings and you had, like, how can I, I don't mean I had, but at school you had sort of things you were told of. You had photographs on the walls which told you the history of the country and how the Soviet Union is, is the only friend. And then in the news, especially kind of once television, I mean, none of us read newspapers as a child. I mean, as a child, I wouldn't have read a newspaper. But, once television came and of course, cinema, for somebody of your generation, what you don't realize, but if you have a look, say, even on American cinema was first you went and you saw the news.
Yeah.
And only then did they, in England then, and in Russia too, if I remember rightly, you'd have then, because I knew the Russian system later as well, you'd have the national anthem and you'd all stand up and then you'd sit down and watch the film.
Okay.
So, and in the news reels, you always had things which told you how awful things were in the West, and how the Western workers were rising against their oppressive, and one of the great things about for your generation, and because this is something I'm really very kind of aware of, is that you can, I can now watch newsreels from the 1950s, whereas, when I was your age, I couldn't, you couldn't watch anything that was more than a few months old. You'd either see it in the cinema, maybe on television, but there were no means of recording it for most part, unless you were, a professional. The first time I actually kind of worked with film material as a graduate student, I had to pay something like £100 an hour just to watch a few frames. Yeah, exactly. It was kind of, because it wasn't digitized, so you had to sit in a room with a camera and watch it like that. So, but now you can see it, and it's quite interesting to see it. Just like, actually, I often also I have a collection now of video films both from the West and the East. It's quite kind of amusing also to watch American newsreels about Eastern Europe, and especially the Cold War ones, because in many ways they're very similar, because they're basically, both of them are saying we're much better than the other side, and this is how you can see it. I mean, one of the curious things, for example, is that you had people like Paul Robeson coming, and this was being used. If you look at sort of films about how the Black people are oppressed in the United States, this was a big propaganda thing during the Cold War, and of course. And the irony is, so we had students in places like Czechoslovakia and Russia and China coming from African countries because it was cheaper to study there than in the West and easier. But it's not as if they had an easy time. On the whole, they were treated like shit half the time as well, because basically racism, was very common, and especially in countries where you've never, in countries where you have no experience of foreigners. And of course, the Cold War, it's part of that. It's the fact that you don't have any means of understanding the world outside. So, even for somebody like me who came from this kind of unusual background, I don't remember ever kind of querying things. And to me, the West was more like, it was about how, things were very pretty, which came from the West. People sent me, my mother had some American friends who would send me dresses, which she said, because she was English, that I shouldn't wear because they're too girly. I remember particularly one American dress with sort of lots of nylon, but, none of that was available. So it was more like, the West is rich and we are poor. But on the other hand, we are socially better, so, we have better education, we have better health, and so on. So it was kind of based on, well, half truth. Some of it was true. So, once the worst of the Cold War was over, i.e. sort of after the death of Stalin in 1953, things got a lot better. The pressures were not as enormous to conform, and people were allowed to travel a tiny bit more. But you couldn't, for example, travel abroad unless, as far as I know, almost anyone who could travel abroad had to be a member of the Communist Party. And, and was expected to report, not only, at work, but also to the secret services. And particularly, it was, everybody knew, certainly, by the time I was old enough to understand all of this, everybody knew that if you had a group of people traveling abroad, one of them would be the one who was from the, who'd be reporting to the secret services. And that, it makes for a kind of what many of my friends would call kind of a double culture. So there were things you talked about at home and things you took, and, and I do remember as a child often being told by my mother, you mustn't talk about that at school.
Right.
Because, the way she explained it was because no one would understand. But what she really meant was that, she could get into trouble. Just a kind of little example of that when we were going to China. So the only way she could leave Czechoslovakia, because I was a Czech subject.
Yes.
She was able to get her British passport back without any difficulty. Again, the world was a different place in those days. So she had to apply for me to be permitted to travel with her to China. And she told me that, so one of the things you had to do at school, among other things, was labor, because we were not supposed to be all intellectuals. We all had to labor. And some of it was quite fun to do, but some of it was incredibly dull. And part of it, I remember, and so one of the things we were supposed to do was plant tomatoes. And my mother, because I don't remember this, of course, because I was 11 years old at the time, but my mother was summoned to school and told, your daughter is already turning a capitalist. And my mother said, why? And she said, because we said that she should plant the tomatoes. And she said, no, she's not going to plant them because she won't be there when they grow up. So there's no point.
Oh, goodness.
You know, so it's really funny, but the notion that she would have been summoned to school for saying things so, minor was just absurd. So, and it's true that, there were things like, again, I mean, I just remember when I was, again, I must have been about 10 or 11, and I was walking in Prague, either from school or to school, I can't remember. And I heard somebody talking English and they were lost. So I helped them.
Yeah.
They were an American couple. I don't know why they were in Prague or whatever, but anyway, they were very impressed by the fact that there was this 11-year-old who could speak fluent English and was Czech. And when they left, they said, is there anything you'd like as a present? And I said chewing gum, because chewing gum wasn't permitted in Czechoslovakia.
Oh.
No. we chewed candle wax.
Really?
Yeah, it's really nice. Hot candle wax is very chewable. It sounds really absurd, but this is the kind of details that people will remember. I can't tell you much about the politics, because on the whole we did talk a bit about the Hungarian uprising, that I do remember, but about the Cold War as such, we didn't, oh, and I suppose Cuba was then very important, but that's another story. But anyway, so they sent me this huge thing of chewing gum, which I received, and I became very popular in school because everyone wanted some chewing gum. But it was an extraordinary rarity.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean. It was kind of like, for somebody of my age, the West was not different in any way, except that it had goods that were totally inaccessible to us. And you didn't really think I'd like to travel there, because nobody traveled there. So and I'm sure that there were people, older people, like among my parents' groups, and it's kind of the same in, I'm sure, many countries, but you gather together friends with whom you have things intellectually in common. So I'm sure they discuss politics a great deal, but as a kid I didn't take part in it, and I didn't really even kind of understand what it meant, that my mother was English, except, I mean, she was very different from anybody else's mother, not least because she worked, which was very uncommon in those days. She wore trousers, which was considered really shocking. I think she was the only woman I ever saw until I was about 12 wearing. She had a pair of pink corduroy trousers, which were very elegant. I have a photograph of her, but at the time I thought it was a horrendous thing to wear. And then she had a green suede jacket. It's funny how one remembers these things. It was kind of like, as soon as you saw her, you knew she was not local.
Okay.
And that's the other thing, kind of, now I say it, because I'm giving you sort of these bits of memories, but there was a time, both in Czechoslovakia and then when I came to England, and when I studied here, you could always tell people from Eastern Europe or from Western Europe by the way they were dressed. So I could tell Russians from 100 miles, I mean, I'm joking, but 100 foot, because they had terrible shoes. They could occasionally, if you have a look at photographs from the Cold War and you see photographs of, say, state deputations, sort of ambassadors, they're all wearing the same clothes. because they were issued by a particular factory which made Western style clothing. But for most part, it was nothing like. But it could just about pass, So like when you get Khrushchev going to America, even before him, much more so before him, but especially after him, everybody kind of dressed very similarly. But they couldn't quite manage the shoe bit, because in Eastern Europe, you could make, there were bits of Eastern Europe that made good shoes, like Yugoslavia, but they were prohibitively expensive. So most people wore local stuff, which was, for my mother, I remember it was an absolute sort of, she was desperate because she had English feet and she couldn't bear this sort of uncomfortable shoes. So she was always asking people to bring her shoes. So it's, it's all kind of, it was, and for most part, people did not kind of approach foreigners, at least not until the late 50s, because it was, how can I say, it could be dangerous. I don't mean dangerous in the sense you'd get arrested, but, it could be that somebody would say, oh, so-and-so is associating with foreigners. And again, in Western Eastern Europe, it was not as bad as all that. In Russia, it was far worse but even in, say, Czechoslovakia or Poland and so on, marriages to foreigners, I mean, girls wanted to get out by marrying foreigners. And, if you were very lucky, you would be allowed out. But boys were never allowed out because, the idea is we need them for the army sort of thing, so we don't get, and it was part of the kind of almost unrecognized sense of women are stupid, so, it doesn't matter. We could lose the odd woman, but we can't afford to lose men. And I was very conscious of that also in my kind of teen years, that on the whole, girls were treated as automatically not as intelligent as men. But I mean, it was not entirely in Eastern Europe. I mean, here too, it took a while, but much more so in Eastern Europe.
Did that manifest in any way? Did that manifest in any way, the gender roles being
Oh, definitely. I mean, it was kind of, it was, if you have a look at, for example, but European as well, European governments, women, if they were in the government, they were there to look after, say, health, so women are nice and kind, so they will do the sort of things like medicine just about, or culture that was considered not that important, so, a woman could do it. But, the notion that, for example, a woman would be a prime minister or a, minister of defense, or, it would have been absolutely unthinkable. And of course, you didn't have women in the army. So in a way, that was good. Yeah. And you also, within the Cold War, you were very aware of, I mean, very early on, I did kind of understand that, for example, I'm not sure whether in Czechoslovakia it was the case, but I think probably as well. But abortion was forbidden. So it's quite common for women to have illegal abortions. And, you heard sort of, by the time I got to the age of 13, 14, I heard of people who'd been very ill because of, badly performed abortions. Because the idea was that it's the duty of the wife, of the woman, to produce children for the country. So that was very much. But again, I'm not sure, you can't really say that is purely in Eastern Europe. It's just there, it's much more kind of prescriptive in the way that it's done. But certainly, like all the teaching professions were filled by women, but all the administration was filled by men. And to the best of my knowledge, I can't remember ever, kind of being told, these women are just wonderful because they run factories or whatever, but you were told about men and you could see it. I mean, part of it is, again, it's very hard to explain. And I explain it, I teach in a very old building because Cambridge is full of very old buildings. My college was founded in 1460 something. I can't remember exactly when. So I can tell you in a moment if I'll look it up. But anyway, and I tell my students, do you notice what's on the walls? Who's on the wall? None of them can tell me. And it's much the same way during the Cold War. I mean, yeah, you could recognize the biggies. Most of the time it was just the wall decoration, that had somebody being lauded for being something or other. It's true that it's clear that sports figures were very much admired even then, So, for example, in Czechoslovakia, we all knew the name of Emil Zatopek, who was a runner. And I think he was famous for having run something, for the first time. Right. So that kind of thing. And football obviously was Czechoslovakia. So, you had countries were proud of certain aspects of them. So Czechoslovakia, the big thing in Czechoslovakia was hockey. And one of the interesting things was that in 1968, when Russia invaded, when you had the occupation, well, it wasn't exactly an occupation, but the suppression of Prague Spring in 68. Soon after that, there was a game between Russia and Czechoslovakia, and it became much more than just a hockey game. It became kind of like, and when the Czechs won, everybody was just so happy. It was so things acquired a meaning that to us nowadays would seem almost incomprehensible. And also things like private life, it's a bit like being in a religious society, except that it's a secular society, but it was considered normal for the state to kind of interfere in people's private lives. So if you wanted to make it within the system, you would be married and have children and, be just a normal person. And divorce was very unusual. The fact that my mother was divorced was very unusual. My father was married 5 times, so that was an incredibly unusual. But that was partly because my mother was his second wife, but then, it's partly because of his arrest and the fact that he went into the mines and so on, things kind of changed in his life. But luckily, his last wife was absolutely lovely, and they, and he was happy. But what I'm saying is, that in itself would have meant that he could not possibly have been considered, a good person, because the idea is that, you have to conform with that. And, the weird thing is that they're kind of basically religious values from most monotheistic religions. They're still but they're kind of represented as if they are communist values, as if they're something new rather than, something. I mean, it's a very interesting thing how much there is in the system which kind of pretends to be completely new, but is actually not at all. No.
So they were doing like a rebranding of
almost, yeah, absolutely. No, that's a good way of describing it.
Okay.
So, but 56, I suppose. I mean, my first really kind of conscious memory is of the death of Stalin. I was tiny, but I do remember that because not only did Stalin die, and you know, it's not that people talked about it in a sort of, they weren't sad about it. Well, they were sad, but not in the sense sad that he died.
Mm.
It became, I mean, among the people I knew, it was clear that they kind of were relieved that he died and sad that all the people who'd had to die before he died. So it's kind of that kind of thing. But in Czechoslovakia, the irony is that the leader of the Czech Communist Party had gone to Stalin's funeral.
Mm.
Stalin died in March and caught a cold, came back and died straight after.
No.
And it kind of, even though I was really little, but I do remember hearing jokes about that.
Mm.
And again, it's kind of, when people talk about the Cold War and the communist system, they don't realize that you had these two cultures, and one of them was incredibly politically astute.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just, as I said, it was the private culture. And of course, not everybody had it. So it depended on what's going on. You've got a voice there.
Oh, don't.
Or is it me? I can hear a voice.
Oh, that's. I don't think so. There's nothing.
You don't hear it?
No,
How
not at all.
Yeah. See, now, if I was in Czechoslovakia during the Cold War, I'd be convinced that someone is listening to us.
Absolutely.
Because I remember occasionally saying to my mother, even in England, she was convinced that people were listening to telephone conversations because she got into the habit. And you never, when I got older, you never phoned people from private phones. You always phoned them from phone boxes. I mean, the bloody awful thing is there's no phone boxes nowadays. But, it meant that you could talk privately because you couldn't be traced.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
That's interesting that it was safer to be outside on the phone than in your own home.
Absolutely. And it was very common. So in many places, flats were very small on the whole, and often they were divided up and so on. So you'd have people, like for about 3 years of my childhood, we lived in a flat that was an apartment by America, which was a 2-bedroom apartment with 1 bathroom and 1 kitchen. But we shared the kitchen, so we each had a bedroom. My mother and I had 1 bedroom, and our neighbor had the other bedroom, and we shared the kitchen and the bathroom.
Yeah.
And what I didn't know then, but I later found out, was that the terrible thing was that had been the house which belonged to the woman who was our neighbor, and it had been divided into these flats.
Oh.
So, yeah.
So she witnessed the
Absolutely
of her entire home.
And it's one of those things that for me, actually kind of was really one of the most difficult things for people nowadays to understand. That the changes, the political changes, the big ones, they're too complicated to understand. It's the little ones that are so much a part of your life, like the fact that somebody says your flat is too big for you, so you've got to share it with a complete stranger. And you're not allowed more than a certain number of square meters per person, and so on. And in some countries it was worse than in others. Czechoslovakia was relatively liberal, and ironically, you could retain the property. It wasn't confiscated. You just had to share it. So after 89, people got back their property. Because, so long as they retained a piece of paper which said it had been their property, So, but in many countries, it meant, like in Russia, you couldn't keep your property.
You just couldn't.
You just couldn't. I mean, because ownership is theft, kind of thing was the slogan. So, you couldn't have. And it's in that people were very aware. of political change. And also it's one of the many, it was that kind of thing, like access to education as well. So both in 48 and then even worse in 51 and, until the death of Stalin, there was this thing of, if you, to get into university, the idea is that you had to be from the right kind of background. So when I was in Moscow, not already since the Cold War, I had a landlady, and I said to her, how come that you could go to university? Because her dad had been arrested and had been shot, had been executed during Stalin's time. And she said, "Oh, I just lied. I said I came from a working class family." So I suppose a few people got away with it like that, but on the whole, you had to have, a proletarian or peasant background in order to get into university. And in most of Eastern European countries, the idea was it's the proletariat is progressive and everyone else is not. So peasants are not as progressive as proletariats. So on the whole, it also was in many ways it often militated also against country people. And I do remember, but again, it happens much less here, but there was a kind of almost instinctive contempt one had for people who were not from the city. They're just peasants, they're just from the countryside, they're ignorant, they don't have, and in a weird way, now that I speak to you, one of the curious things is that it was quite a lot of it was about possessions. So if you were in the city, you had a television, maybe when televisions became available, you had certain kind of furniture and so on. Whereas if you were in the countryside, you wouldn't have all of these things. You might own your house, but, it was considered these houses were miserable because they didn't have central heating or whatever, they lacked. Of course, after 89, quite a lot of people realized that actually living in the countryside is a lot nicer than living in the city. And that whole kind of relationship changed. But yeah, what else? Any more? Do you have any other questions you want to ask me?
I do. But just to maybe clarify on that last thing that you said. So when it came to the elite or those the children who belong to maybe the party or upper class.
If you were a member of the party, then your children obviously got a leg up.
Okay.
It was very helpful. Yeah.
Okay. Definitely.
Yeah. And everybody had these kind of you had a piece of paper which said, what your background was. So, what did your father do and so on. And in some of them, in the worst period of the Cold War, it asked things like, has your father ever been abroad? And, or is he religious and so on. And again, it depends on which country, but in some countries it was perfectly, like in Czechoslovakia, the anti-religious thing wasn't that bad on the whole, until 68. Curiously, in 68, it was kind of, they were really worried about the church. Yeah. But before that, in my childhood, I don't remember it was considered sort of, how can I say, the term was that it was a prejudice or, something that people believed in God, but lots of people believed in God. And in my case, I could be baptized and go to confirmation and all that kind of thing. And it wasn't, as far as I know, it wasn't held against anybody, if that's the case. But I presume that and there were some members of the church who were very influential and taught at universities, but you had to, I gather, they had to be quite careful, in some ways, so you couldn't kind of say, this government is anti-Christian, so don't listen to them, so that kind of thing. But, so long as you kept off politics up to a point. And the same thing is, what's interesting is if you look at films, from the different countries, you will be aware how varied the policy was depending on where you were.
Where you were in Eastern Europe?
In Eastern Europe, exactly. So, for example, Czech films, even, certainly from the early 60s, they're amazingly complex, and they make fun of all kinds of things, which, they're really quite politically sensitive. Ditto with Polish stuff, Polish literature, Polish film. Bulgarian is very non-challenging. Romanian even less so. So, it's partly, of course, to some extent, the Cold War comes to countries which have completely different governance traditions anyway. So the Czech Republic, which is where I was born, was before the war one of the most successful economically countries in Europe. It didn't have immigration and so on. Whereas Poland, which was largely peasant, had huge amount of immigration, especially in the 30s during the Depression. That's, for example, why we in England now have a very large Polish population, because many, many came here to work on the lands in the 20s and 30s, like the Irish and so on, So it's that kind of thing. Hungary was also quite successful economically. And, both countries had a very sophisticated democratic system. And, weirdly, in Czechoslovakia, technically, it remained a multi-party system. So it never...
This whole time? I mean,
all the time. Absolutely. One of my grandfathers was the head of a party. I mean, admittedly, I gather, he probably didn't kind of do very much against, the system, but he was from a different party. He was not from the Communist Party. But he was I think he was protected both by what had happened before. He'd been kind of one of the founders of the modern Czechoslovakia and that kind of thing. So, but in some cases, people were prosecuted exactly for that. So, I don't always know why, some people were lucky and others weren't. And it wasn't just a simple thing that some people cooperated and others didn't. As is always the case in history, we like to kind of say that everything has a reason, but actually, as far as I'm concerned, as I get older and older, I think accident plays a huge part in history. Yeah. I mean, as a historian of Russia, I had no idea 4 years ago that Putin would do what he's done. And nobody I know, people kind of said, you've got to be careful, and Russia, could become aggressive again. But the notion that they would do something as mad as this was kind of unthinkable. And, I have lots of Russian friends. And of course, it's very different from the Cold War, partly because they could leave, partly because so far, at least, no one's had their property confiscated just because they've left. There are fewer arrests, of course, than there were in the 50s, So it's kind of slightly better. But some of the aspects of the Cold War are getting there, like kind of saying we are so much better than the West. And, the West is one of the extraordinary things is the way that Putin, in that speech that he made, kind of saying the West is trying to corrupt us morally, and he keeps, he's saying that they're pedophiliacs and they're homosexuals, and they want this and this and this, and we're not going to be corrupted because, and so it's and that's certainly, in the Cold War, it wasn't quite as clearly enunciated, but there was also an element of the West is more corrupt. One of my favorite kind of anti-American films shows early rock and roll dancing. And the funny thing is, it's clear that actually the directors love it. They love the dancing, but so long as underneath you say this is corrupt,
Mm-hmm.
it's okay, because there was the public thing, and then there was, as I said, there was the private thing.
Yeah.
And people, so you couldn't, for example, I mean, one of the extraordinary things is that you couldn't kind of freely buy any newspapers from the West, only newspapers published by communist parties in the West. So, in England, the communist newspaper was the Daily Worker. So that was the only English newspaper people could read.
Right.
Yeah. So, of course, you also, if by any chance and people wanted to read foreign languages.
Mm.
And again, it depends on the country. In some countries, Western literature became inaccessible, so weirdly it was kept in libraries. It just was, kind of put away.
Yeah.
I suppose a bit like in Florida, you kind of, you so long as people can't get at it, it's okay. But in other countries, it all continued, but it's kind of officially you had to say, this is corrupt. I read it and it's corrupt, but, great. So, it certainly in the Czech Republic, people continued to read and translate from English. Quite a variety of both American English and British English writing.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things you talked about that I wanted to pick up on was the feeling of being a foreigner, even though you were Czech, and very much in the sense. Then when it came to moving to China, what was that like, those 4 years and that?
That was extraordinary. I mean, again, because it just shows you, because for me, even though China was in the Eastern Bloc, it was nothing like Czechoslovakia.
Right.
I mean, it was, and part of it, yes, was a foreigner. So for one thing, once I began to understand Chinese, I realized that everybody thought I was Russian, because the only foreigners they'd ever had were Russians.
Yeah.
So there were two ways of being described. One was Sulianren, which was a Soviet person, and the other one was Dabidze, which is big nose. The Chinese noses were much smaller.
Yeah.
And later on, once I began to speak Chinese, obviously people thought that I could come from the Western, the Western parts of China. You obviously have people who are more European looking. I mean, so it's, they thought maybe I come from, some obscure part of, because if you have a huge country, it's perfectly possible. But no, I mean, it's, because it's extraordinary, because in my life, I've traveled all over the world. In many places, I felt I could live here and feel at home. But, in some places, like China, for me at that point, there was no way, because you were immediately kind of noticeably foreign. Yeah. Czechoslovakia, not. Later on, because I first went to Russia when I was 17 years old. And by then I was also, I speak Russian like a native. Most Russians can't tell that I'm not Russian. So I could get away with it in a way that I could never have got away with it in China, So, and that made me so aware also of, I mean, it depends on, again, the atmosphere. Even during the Cold War, it's not that people automatically hated foreigners. They could either be nervous about speaking to them in case they got into trouble, as I said to you, or they were immensely curious to ask questions that they would not find the answers to. And I got quite a lot of that, certainly in Russia. And once people realized that, it wasn't so obvious that I was a foreigner that they'd get into trouble for talking to me.
Oh.
Yeah. Because, I mean, it's kind of hard to accept. So after 68, the first time, well, I first went to Czechoslovakia after 68 properly.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember going, I think, yeah, when my daughter was 1 year old, so it must have been 78, I went to see one of my relatives and we had a lovely time. I stayed with them. And then on about the fourth day, she said, I've just been summoned to to the police, to the secret department to ask about you. And she said, we discussed nappies. So she gave them detailed, and she could get away with it. But the fact is that, it was kind of considered normal that just because you have a foreigner staying with you, you can summon that person and ask them, what are they doing with you? What are you talking about? And so on. And, half the time it wasn't because you want to, it's kind of not because you're controlling, but you're just reminding people, we're watching you. You can't just get, so don't think that you're totally free. And one of the curious things, again, and it's interesting to kind of, it's a number that people seldom kind of really think about, but the question is how many people work in any country for the secret services. What proportion of the population is involved in working in some branch of it. In some cases, it's quite unexpected. In Europe, as I understand it, the highest proportion is in Switzerland, which I never thought was the case. Indeed. Yeah. But of course, like in places like Russia or Czechoslovakia, if you were working for the secret services, obviously the bigger your department, the more you got paid. So you wanted to say you had many more people. So you would ask, like, my cousin would come and presumably they would record her as having cooperated, i.e. being a member of the staff when she wasn't. I have a feeling that in a number of cases, these numbers are there purely in order to kind of, magnify the importance of your department. And that, incidentally, is also one of the curious things which the Russians had to get, one of the reasons why at the moment quite a lot of people are no longer so in love with the American experiment is because in the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia too, the bigger, you could say, oh, this is a great enterprise because we have lots of people working for us. I remember going to a university in the Urals and, the guy was saying, we are now so many million people, so many thousands of people. And I'd say, is that a good thing that you've got so many staff? And of course, once the American experiment came in, the thing was, oh, let's sack people. We don't need people. So of course, the one thing in the Eastern European system, when it was not too oppressive, was the fact that you had guarantees of housing, guarantees of medical services, and guarantees of work. You really had to be pretty awful to get sacked, or you had to do it for political reasons. So, I knew people who got sacked for political reasons, but I never knew anybody who was sacked for doing nothing, which is kind of curious. And quite a lot of my friends were able to get away with murder. You just kind of as the proverb was, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. Because salaries were low, are very basic. So, it was a kind of like, you can't sack us, but, got to keep paying us. And you, even though your flat was not owned by you, but you couldn't be, thrown out. Again, unless you committed some, but even then, I mean, the curious thing is, like my landlady in Moscow, I was really so surprised. So her father was arrested in 19 41.
Mm-hmm.
So at the time of Russia's entry into war, because he'd, at a game of poker, he had said that he wasn't surprised that the Belarusians had, or Ukrainians had welcomed the Germans when they came, because, they'd had a rough time. And one of his friends reported on him and he got arrested. She knew all that because his file then came to light afterwards. But she and her mother lived in the flat where he'd come from. I was amazed. And it's true that they had to kind of move out of the larger flat that they lived in, which he had owned, into a smaller one. But I was astounded that, they hadn't said they have to move out of Moscow. In some cases, people did have to move out of Moscow. But again, they were still able to retain the right, somebody from their family could look after their flat. So it was more complex than I had imagined once you kind of look into it. So, yeah. It was, ironically, that was one of the reasons why it was such an economically useless system, because it had so much administration for everything. They just couldn't keep up with it. And yeah, there's a wonderful Italian film that was made in the 1960s. It was then remade in America as Clute. Have you heard of Clute? No. Brilliant film too. But in that, the story of the film is that the head of, I think it's the Milan police, is a murderer. Mm-hmm. Nobody can accuse him because he's the head of Milan police. And the first time I was in Russia, because in Russia you had this thing where you could go to open air, well, like in America, you had open air cinemas. So I was sitting in this open air cinema watching this Italian film. And by the way, Italian films, when things when the thaw happened with Khrushchev, you had a bit more kind of contact with the West, and particularly places like Italy and France, not so much England. Anyway, they were showing this film, and in the film, you see the guy, the policeman, listening to tapes of recordings of people's conversations, trying to work out if somebody knows that he's the one who's the murderer. And I could hear behind me the voice of somebody saying, "So is that how it's done?" It was about Italy, but they saw it as, about Russia. Yeah. So it was quite interesting. And a lot of that happened. Yeah.
And so you said you first went back to Czechoslovakia in 1964?
No, 68.
68. Okay. That was,
yeah. Actually, maybe. No, yeah, it was 68, just after the invasion.
Okay.
Yeah. And
what was that like, just coming back to that? And
it was really depressing, as you can imagine. Because a lot of my friends, my family left. If they could, they'd left. Because in 68, as soon as it became clear, and again, that's the huge difference. It's a bit like a little bit with Ukraine now. People were allowed to just get up and cross the border. Mm-hmm. A few countries opened their borders. So, and the irony is that, of course, a number of people went for political reasons. A number of people went because this was the first opportunity they had to go to the West, and start. And I have, like last night, I was with a friend of mine who left in 68, and she's had a wonderful career here. She never kind of lost her contact with home.
Yeah.
But, it was an opportunity that presumably she would not have had she never been able to go abroad. So, sometimes it's ghastly what these things, but if people survive them, it can, ironically can have, and of course, from the point of view of the receiving countries, as far as I'm concerned, it's also incredibly kind of good thing. But in 68, yeah, no, it was really depressing. Yeah. But it was also, it was the first time I really realized how different the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia was from the Soviet Union.
Mm.
The Soviet Union was just, both economically and politically and socially hugely behind developments in Czechoslovakia. I mean, silly thing like, I was telling one of my friends, I walked into a shop in Prague because I needed to buy something. And this young woman came up to me and said, "Can I help you?" And I looked at her, it took me a while, because in Russia, no one ever would say, "Can I help you?" On the contrary, you'd have to kind of beg them to help you because so little was available. And the shop girl was the king because she gave access to things. Yeah. And there was a huge black market, so you could only buy things. I'll tell you a story, which is not really historically important, but I traveled to the Soviet Union with a group of English people, and one of them lost his suitcase. Mm-hmm. So I had to go with him to buy things to replace, as his interpreter. And we went into what was a men's shop. Mm-hmm. And we said, "Do you have any underpants and pajamas?" And they looked at us and said, "Sorry, no." And I said, "Can you tell me where can we get them?" And they said, "You've got to go to the children's shop." So we went to the children's shop. And it was in the children's shop because nobody except children went there. So they had a few. And this person said, "If you go to my mate so-and-so and tell them that you'll pay in hard currency, you can get," so we got him all. But there was this saying that in Russia that you can't buy anything, but you can get everything. Mm. Because if you had the money or the contacts, you could actually get it. And Czech Republic was never like that. And I said to my aunt, "Should we go to the theatre?" And she said, "Well, there's very few tickets." And I said, "It's all right, I've got hard currency, I'll pay for it in dollars." She said, "This is not the Soviet Union. We don't do that kind of thing." So, it's things like that. It was, it was a different morality. And you can see the difference even now. I mean, it's not like the Czech Republic is free of corruption, but it's nothing like as bad as it was in post-Soviet Russia. Mm. So we've gone a long way away from the Cold War.
Definitely. It's good to see. I
mean, one of the most extraordinary experiences from my point of view of the Cold War, and I haven't got the photograph here, is that so in China, in Beijing, I went to the Russian school there because the Russians had been thrown out after the Soviet Union and China fell out. Mm-hmm. So, and it was a brilliant school. I really loved it. And the teachers were wonderful. And there, as I said, this was the place where it was okay for me to be there. It was officially okay. And the teachers kind of thought I was clever, so they treated me really nicely. And, and I had a very privileged life, and I loved it. And my best friend was half Chinese and half Russian. And we both, we're in our teens, and I get nice clothes from my grandmother in England. So we kind of, we would, because at this point, everyone in China is wearing blue suits, those blue kind of Mao suits. So it was kind of nice to wear things like that too. And we went to the universities, and the university was full of Cuban students because, of course, it was, after Castro. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, why I speak Spanish, because I wanted to speak, because they were charming, and I wanted to learn how to dance. Mm-hmm. But at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I remember thinking, so here I am in China. If you do have a nuclear war, do I get killed because I'm British in China, or because I'm in China, or because I go to a Soviet school? This is kind of, and at the moment there's a little bit of, people, friends that I know are in this ridiculous position of there is a political world which is so divorced from everybody's everyday lives. And yet we are totally dependent upon decisions being made which are beyond our everyday lives. Because some idiot might decide that, it would be good to threaten with a missile.
Right.
Yeah. So, but, that's in a way what Cold War was. It's more complicated. For the vast majority of people, I would say, like our neighbors in Czechoslovakia, the people that my mother would say, don't tell them, such, like, don't talk to them about ... And by the way, that probably is a very common experience. Whichever class you came from, whichever background you had, is you didn't talk about sensitive things with people. But you always had a circle of friends who you thought you could trust.
Exactly.
With whom you would talk, partly because nobody, it was kind of, that, I don't know if you know that story about, what is it, the king has ass's ears. Have you heard that story? It's a wonderful fairy tale about this guy who was I think it's Eastern European originally, but there's this barber, and he gets summoned secretly to the court. And he's told, you mustn't tell anybody, what you will see when you do the king's hair.
Okay.
And when he does the king's hair, he discovers that the king has ass's ears. And so, he spends his life kind of doing the hair and thinking, I can't, he can't tell his wife, he can't tell anybody. And one day, he's just so desperate that he goes to a tree and says, the king has ass's ears. And then somehow the tree starts talking and saying, the king has ass's ears. And, then you have, depending on where you are, in what country, then the king admits and everything is well, and nobody gets killed, But it's that kind of thing where if you're living in a world which is where you officially can't say anything, you need to be able to say a few things to your friends.
Yeah.
And that's how you got these very, you got groups of writers. Most of my friends were artists because my father was a painter. You can see one of his pictures up here. Yeah. So, that's how you met people. So I knew people from the theater and so on. And it was amazing what we talked about in private, especially once we'd had a drink or two. But, and that was actually one of the extraordinary things as well, is that it was intellectually, these were very interesting times. Because it was, when I think about it, because people, weirdly, nobody got paid anything, but therefore they had time to sit in their kitchens for hours and talk about, politics and so on. Whereas nowadays, everybody has to go to work and, has only a few hours spare time. And if they're spare time, then they're not going to be spending it, inviting friends to talk about politics. So it's kind of, the world has changed in that sense as well.
Yeah.
So intellectually, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, part of it is obviously when you're younger, there are certain things which you will value whatever happens, even if you know that, I mean, for my generation, the worst thing is that we thought the world was getting better. And now we're kind of, my children's generation is the first generation, I think, which has a lower standard of living than their parents. it never occurred to me that, such a thing could happen.
Mm.
They live, my grandchildren, they live with threats of the kind that I find, I thought we'd kind of would never hear again. So, no.
Yeah. You also talked a lot about your academic life and how, I mean, sounded like you were naturally gifted, and then we know that you ended up, being an academic for most of your life. So, what prompted the decision to study Russia? What drew you to that? And
it was purely it was mainly because in China, going to a Russian school turned out to be a lot easier than going to a Chinese school. Chinese school nearly killed me because, I'm joking. I mean, I don't mean that.
no,
but my parents were advised by their doctor that really I should take, because in the Chinese school, there was no heating. So if you ever see photographs of kids doing exercises, it's not because they need to do exercise. We used to have to get up every hour to do these exercises just to, keep, because it was so bloody cold, and you were in padded jackets. And I had to eat Chinese food, because I couldn't bring my food. It would have been unfair to eat my kind of food. And this was at a time when it was the failure of the Great Leap Forward. So there was very serious hunger. And when we first arrived in Beijing, the only things you could freely get was cabbage and rice, and even rice was limited. So in the schools, it was very limited. So whereas, of course, where my parents were living and where we were living, we had everything we needed. It's just that I couldn't take it to school. So the Russian school was a lot easier. And of course, because Czech is a Slavonic language and so is Russian, it's a lot easier, obviously, to learn. In China, I was having, you need 3,000 characters just to read the newspapers. So life was pretty tough, having to learn all of this all the time. And just constantly, I had this feeling that I was going to get behindhand because I could sort of understand what they were talking about, but I couldn't really understand it because, as you probably know, comprehension comes very quickly, but the ability to speak and to express yourself is much more complex.
Yes.
Yeah. So after that, the Russian school was dead easy. And I think partly because of the way I'd been brought up, I realized that if you sound like a foreigner, people speak to you differently. Whereas if you kind of sound like a native, then they speak to you very differently. So, ever since I've been a kid, and I suppose also because my mother was, she spoke French in such a way that the French people didn't know she wasn't French. She spoke German that way. It kind of seemed a normal thing to do. And I suppose, and she always said to me, it's not just grammar and, language. You have to, understand the history and read the literature and, that kind of. So the way I was encouraged from a very early age to understand that language is not about words, it's about concepts and so on. So I learned Russian very easily. And by the time, after my second year in the Russian school, I was completely fluent and I got good results in the school. And the next year I did what is the English GCS, you have to do these courses by correspondence course, which is quite funny. So there was an Oxford school which taught me. And because in those days, there was no email, so I would get homework and I'd post it off. And a month later, I'd get back my, because it took 2 weeks to get there and 2 weeks to come.
Oh, goodness.
And I often wonder what the teachers thought, who, because, you didn't see them. They, they had no idea who I was. They just knew that there was this 14-year-old who was doing Latin and mathematics and all these things. It's quite funny. So, yeah. So, and then I came to England and I thought I want to do something that's apolitical.
Okay.
So originally, so I did pure maths, applied maths, and physics for my A levels.
Really?
Yeah, I know, weird, but I wanted to do something, and again, it's part of it was sort of like defying what people thought I was good at.
Hmm.
Everyone would say, "Oh, you're so good at languages, and you'll want to do languages." And you know, and I suppose part of my thing also, I realize now with hindsight that my mother kept saying any fool can speak lots of languages, so it didn't seem like a big thing. So, whereas she was very impressed by the fact that I could do maths because she couldn't. It was sort of part of that. And I thought I was going to do economics at
Hmm.
university. And then in England, you have this thing where you apply to university. Well, in those days, you did. So
Mhm.
you did your A levels, your three or four or five. In my case, it's five subjects for A level. And then you have 6 months during which you apply to university, you have interviews or had, and
Mhm.
then they tell you whether you can come or you can't. So I was applying to Oxford, and I did this. And so then I had 6 months at school preparing for the exams and so on. And then I had, wanted to find a job. And it was considered normal, by the way, to
Mhm.
do a job between school and university. The idea being that it kind of makes you independent and
Yeah.
also gives you a bit of money. And of course, in those days, university didn't cost anything. You only had to pay for your living costs. We didn't pay any fees. So, and I first did a job, like administration job. I was bored out of my mind, and I realized I'd been no good at a sort of 9 to 5 job.
Mhm.
Um, and then I still don't quite know how that happened, but that's what I mean by accident. The place where I was working, I passed a place which said tours to the Soviet Union. And that was a very unusual thing. So I walked in there and I said, "Do you need anybody with Russian?" And they said, "Well, actually, can you translate into Russian?" And they gave me a piece of paper and I did it for them. And they said, "Well, actually, the person who's going to be our rep for 6 months, she can't go.
Mhm.
Would you like to go?" And I said, "Oh, yes, please." So I was sent to Russia for 6 months.
Oh my
Uh,
God.
and it was amazing. I traveled all over the Soviet Union, writing reports about hotels and so on. It was absolutely wonderful. Um, I mean, it was wonderful also, and sometimes,
Yeah.
nothing is perfect, but, to be a 17-year-old, having such an exciting time.
Mhm.
And of course, people were very nice to me as well, because it was so unusual to have somebody, a teenager basically doing this job. Um, so it was really good. And one of the places I went to was, because we traveled all over, and one of the places was in a medieval city.
Mhm.
And because a very famous Russian filmmaker called Tarkovsky was making a film there, they put all the bells back on the churches because a lot of the churches had been closed, obviously,
Yeah.
during the Soviet period. And so there, here you are, and it was just wonderful. And I met the people who were making the film, and I had a really interesting time. And I realized that even Russians didn't really know much about their medieval history, let alone we. We only knew about modern history. And I didn't want to do modern history because that was too political. So after that, I thought, oh, well, that's what I want to do. So that's how I started. I came back to England and I did something which was called European Studies, which allowed me to study European history as well as, so it was, you used the language to kind of study with, but you didn't have to learn language. So that's what was good. So, and it was really interesting. And then for my dissertation, I did dissertation, then I went and did my PhD at Oxford, and then I went to Cambridge.
Where you've been.
Yeah. Where I've been on and off ever since.
Oh.
I mean, yeah, yeah, since I was 27.
Mhm. And I'm curious, what was the reason that you were so adamant on not doing something political? 'Cause-
Because I was very aware from very early on
okay.
that, you know, there's no two-way. No two people think exactly the same about politics. And there's no, I still feel that truth and politics are not two things that go together very often. And I didn't, because when you do modern political stuff, especially, during the Cold War, it was so angled. You either sort of said everything is terrible, or there's some really interesting interviews, sort of like BBC interviews and Russian interviews from about the 1987, so at the time of the Gorbachev perestroika, when you first start getting communication. And you can see that both sides are saying, well, they look normal, the other side, but don't trust them, it's because it was like looking at a zoo for both of them, and because I had lived in these countries, like when we came back from China, it was just a few years before the Cultural Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And, everybody said, was it really terrible in China and so on? And I said, no, because where I was living, it wasn't like that. But people couldn't, if you, unless, I could see, I remember in Oxford, somebody kind of saying to me, but that means that you are, what did he say, ideologically kind of, that you've been corrupted by propaganda. And I said, no, I just, for me, it wasn't like that. And I didn't see how it was for ordinary people, because that wasn't the kind of life I was living. We hardly ever saw people, outside this very small foreign community in those days. It was actually the same in the Soviet Union, because technically you weren't allowed to travel more than 30 miles outside the city where you were registered to be allowed. So, when I was a student there, as a graduate student, I was allowed to go to Moscow and Petersburg, or Leningrad as it was then. But technically, I wasn't allowed more than 30 miles out of either of them without special permission.
Okay.
But because I spoke such good Russian, I got away with murder. I traveled quite a lot outside, more than 30 miles. But depending, again, this is the interesting thing, is you had people who were willing to take the risk of getting into trouble for having helped me to do this. But I wasn't the only one. There were lots of people I knew who were doing this kind of thing. So long as you had the language and the gift of the gab. And it was a great help to be a girl, and it was quite good to be pretty. So, all of these you could use. Like if people said to me, so where's your passport? I just kind of look silly and say, oh, I think I've left it somewhere at home. I was just sort of doing the silly thing. Kind of shameful, but, it worked. So, I told my mother, she was horrified.
No, it's impressive. It's really
you do what you need to do. And for me, I wanted to travel. I wanted to see places. And I wanted to kind of, after China particularly, I wanted to try and understand another culture a little bit more. The funny thing is I've also traveled in Africa many years later. And, particularly, the only place I really traveled was Nigeria. But that's a little bit like China, in the sense that if you are in Lagos, that's fine. You get, you're a foreigner, everybody accepts that you're a foreigner. But as soon as you travel anywhere kind of outside, it's so obvious that you're an outsider. You can't, there's no way that people aren't curious about you and wonder what the hell you're doing there half the time, So, but on the whole, people are very nice to you. And this is the curious thing as well, that as a foreigner, if you're not at war, or if you're not an oppressor, then people are nice to you. And I've been very lucky that I've, on the whole, I've never been anywhere as the representative of an occupying country. So, or indeed as a poor immigrant, which, both of these are kind of horrendous things for people to have to deal with. No, I feel very conscious of the fact that I belong to a very fortunate generation, and yeah, and then I've been very lucky. Yeah.
And okay, as my last question is, now that we've talked about all these places that you've been and lived, and given the context that Czechoslovakia is no longer what it once was, where is home now, or what feels like home?
I mean, it has to be England
Yeah.
because I've lived here the longest, and because that's the language which comes the most naturally to me now. But when I'm in Czechoslovakia, actually, I've just been invited to go back to Prague to give some lectures. But on the way there, I was talking to somebody and they said, I would never know that you're not Czech, which is kind of lovely, and makes me very happy because I would have hated to lose, that which was so important to me. And I was proud of being Czech. And, and in a way I felt, and I've never felt English, even though I'm at home here. And I didn't, my children, I mean, my son, he is very English. There's no way he could be anything else. But my daughter is much more aware of her kind of mixed background, maybe because she's living in America, where you encounter people from so many different cultures. And because, you are of a generation, it's very interesting, I was listening to it this morning, that, people are kind of discovering their background in a way that they never used to. And one of the things that this guy was saying, which I think is absolutely accurate, is that like the first generation of immigrants in any country, they kind of want to assimilate because they need to survive. So they don't want constantly to. The second generation, the third generation already are much more interested in that past because they're aware of the fact that it shaped them and they want to understand it. But often it's kind of so far away already from their experience that they have to learn it all over again. And it's true. I think that is the case. So, yeah, I mean, I do feel English. Well, I don't feel English, but England is my home. And I'm pretty proud of on the whole, except for, like most governments, ours is appalling. But, I'm proud of the fact that, I was talking to one of my Russian friends and he was saying, you are so lucky. You've had 3 prime ministers in quick succession. You've been able to get rid of them. And I said, yeah, no, it's something to be proud of that, you have a bad government. You don't just hang on, keep that they can't stay in place. Though admittedly, one of our worst prime ministers, Boris Johnson, has managed to already earn 5 million in the United States. Can you imagine for his speeches? I know. Why would anyone want to pay him? I can't imagine. But there it is. People are crazy. And that's another reason I know, I felt I didn't want to do anything political. Because politics distorts in a way that a historian understands is not the case.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a lot more complicated the more you think about it. Just all these, yeah.
And your generation has so much more information than mine did. And that's so hard. Because, what do you look at? Do you look, at photographs? When I think about it, whoever will have to kind of, each one of us probably produces about 15 photos a day. And, I, as a child, I think, there's somewhere behind me, there's a little kind of tiny thing of my entire childhood.
In Yeah, it's
in one book. Whereas, my grandchildren, I could have a picture a day if I
yeah.
wanted. So how is somebody going to kind of look at these photographs and try and, make anything of it? I can't imagine. Film, video, social, whatever they call things, like Instagram. I keep thinking, like Facebook is
Mm,
amazing, much as I disapprove of a lot of it. But from the point of view of the Russian situation, it's really amazingly informative. I can tell what my friends are feeling and, whether some of them are still feel courageous enough to kind of talk about the political situation
mm,
in a way that I would not have been able had it not been for Facebook.
true.
So yeah, but China is a very interesting example
Mm,
because technically you can't go on Facebook in China, but
yeah.
because you have VPNs, you can.
Mm,
Yeah, it's crazy.
yeah.
And, so I'm kind of glad that I will be too old by the time that people will have to leave, use this. Because, I think people will be lucky if they can study the history of one day.
No, yes, exactly. There'll be too much to comprehend.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make sense of a situation like this right now with Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah,
What do you even look at? Like, where do you even begin?
quite. And on both sides, there's stuff that probably is made up.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
on the whole, I trust the Ukrainians more than the Russians, but nonetheless, I have heard that they too can fake things.
Mm.
Have we finished my interview? Can I ask you some questions?
Of course, definitely.
So, you say your family comes from Uganda
Yes.
originally. Yeah. When did they come to where?
Oh no,
You sound English.
I'm Ugandan, so I'm this is my
Mm.
first time in the US actually. So I've
Uh,
been here for only 6 months. I grew up.
wow.
Yeah, I grew up in Uganda and a bit of time in Kenya, and then I went to boarding school in Eswatini, which is
Ah,
yeah,
yeah.
Southern Africa. And yeah, it was British schools most of my life. So everyone says
Yeah,
like,
because I kept thinking, where's the accent? I can't tell. 'Cause-
it was our teachers and I guess
Yeah.
the stuff we were exposed to,
Mm.
um, and all that. And also it was an international community, so it was everyone kind of
So you
didn't
know
know what to
exactly
sound
what
like.
you're
So we
talking about.
tried to all
Yeah.
sound, yeah, so we all
Mhm.
tried to sound like whatever we could make up that made sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And presumably you also encountered the fact that, different countries view each other very differently, even if they're neighbors.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, if you say, I come from so and so, people immediately make assumptions
Mm,
about
mm.
you, which are kind of
No, for sure.
extraordinary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think here a lot of the exposure, at least to African identity or African culture is West African. So they'll say, "Oh,
Yeah.
do you eat this or do you listen to this?" And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Funny. Yeah, no, I I have a very close friend in Zimbabwe, and I've
Mm,
been there quite a few times. And
mm.
it's kind of extraordinary because after Nigeria, it's such a completely different country. And so Harare is a little bit like being on the outskirts of London in
Is
parts of
it?
Harare. Oh, definitely. It's extraordinary. It's very, it's a bit like bits of South Africa as
Mm.
well. Whereas in Lagos, I never, Nigeria is Nigeria,
Yeah,
whatever, however much it had been a colony, but it kind of wasn't marked in the same way. It's
yeah,
quite extraordinary. Yeah. But therefore, and again, people don't realize the sheer size of some of these places.
yeah.
It's just when when you fly from South Africa to England and you spend hours and hours flying over empty land. It's quite extraordinary and suddenly hits you. This is
Yeah.
what it really is like. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how long will you be in Florida?
My course is for 4 years, and I'm
Oh,
hoping that I can get a 1 year visa so that it gives you some time to find a job or to
yeah.
work. So that's as far as I've thought.
But are you working towards a PhD?
No, it's just an undergraduate degree.
Gosh. So you're in your first year at university.
Mhm.
That's very impressive. I thought you were at least a fourth year.
Oh
God.
no.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's pretty good that you're doing all of this already. Yeah. Have you any idea what you want to do in the end?
Not really.
I didn't have any idea either in my first year at university.
Yeah.
No. All I knew was that I didn't want to be poor.
It's really important not to think about that.
But yeah.
So, I mean, I'm a journalism major right now, but
Right.
last semester I took a class on European experience, and then I was like, I think I want to do more of this. And so I've been taking more, so I took this Cold War class, I'm taking more classes. Um, I might pick up my French again. So
Yeah.
it's trying to figure out where my
Well, in
passion.
America, it's a much broader undergraduate degree, so you get more choices.
Yeah.
By the way, before talking to you, I was reading something in the New Yorker.
Hmm.
What is it called again? Hang on, let me just find it. That's it. How the biggest fraud in German history unraveled.
Ooh.
And it's really fascinating. And I think it's partly interesting because this is about a guy who he trained to be a banker and then he became a journalist.
Hmm.
Oh, he was a banker and then he became a journalist. With his name, I suspect that I know that he comes from a very well-known family, which he doesn't mention, because he clearly got access that not everybody would have. But it's fascinating partly because it's sort of, firstly, it's interesting about what journalists can or cannot do
Mm.
and discover and publish and so on. But partly also because he talks about the nature of kind of the lies and kind of extraordinary commercial wrongfulness that was typical of a certain period, which may still be going on for all I know. But he's talking about the 90s and early. I think this period. Let me just have a look when. I mean, the whole thing blew up about 2016, and it's about a company that was founded in 2000.
Mhm.
But it's just extraordinary that people got away with it because, again, it's sort of you have a society which is largely ignorant
Mhm.
and who accept people saying things, like, we make 215,000% profit. And you think, how can you make these? But this is what incidentally happened in Russia straight after uh, the change. There were so many people who were kind of doing pyramid schemes and so on. And because people were ignorant, they were so easily cheated. It was
Right.
ridiculous. Yeah. Including my landlady. I kept saying to her, because there was something, and she said, "Oh, people just put in $10 and, they get $100 at the end of the month." And, she kept putting money in there. And I said, "So what does this company make?" "Oh, nothing." And I said, "It doesn't happen. You can't make money out of nothing."
Hmm.
Didn't listen to me, unfortunately. But, yeah. But, how could she? She hadn't, it was sort of, it's like, for her, it was like Chinese, I guess.
Yeah.
Totally incomprehensible. Anyway, it was lovely to meet you. Let me know if you need any more
Much.
help. Yeah.
Definitely. I will.
Come and
Thank you
visit
so
Cambridge.
I would love to.
Okay. Let me know. If
Yeah.
you have a reason to be in England anytime, let me know.
Well, thank you
It's
so
a good
much.
place to study as well. Yeah. Did you get a scholarship in Florida? Is
Yes.
that how you, yeah. That's the problem because British universities are really bad about
Yeah.
undergraduates. They're okay for graduates, but for undergraduates, a nightmare. Yeah. Uh,
Yeah,
well, enjoy.
I
I
will.
yeah. What will you do with this interview?
So, um, I will send it over to the oral history um organization, and then for my assignment, I have to do some additional reading based on some of the things that we've talked about, and then I have to come
Mhm.
up with a presentation, which I'll
Right.
also share with you. And
Good.
it's just a summary of what we've talked about.
Yeah.
So just so that it's
Yeah.
easier for her, I guess, to
Because I've actually, I mean, I've covered such a huge area. It must be a bit tough. Sorry. It's
No, no, no. Of course, I mean everything was insanely relevant, and I'm sure I'll just pick up on one or two things and then
yeah,
go
sure.
from there.
Mm.
But
Be surprised if your teachers understand some of it, even. Yeah, it's
no,
quite funny because with my students, some of the time, I forget that they really are so young, like you. They don't, the world that I know and which was familiar to me just doesn't
mm,
exist.
mm,
Like, you talk about the Soviet Union or the Civil War, but nobody actually, unless you go to North Korea, you
yeah,
know, you really have no idea what I'm talking about.
yeah,
And even North Korea isn't anything like that because
mm,
it's, luckily there were, none of my experience were as extreme as living in North Korea.
yeah,
That must be kind of, and yet you have people there also who kind of, they're young and happy
yeah,
because they presumably know, they don't know anything else. And if they're not in the countryside and starving, maybe things are not too bad. And if you have a career, you kind of presumably kind of live with it.
yeah.
But yeah, I'm kind of glad that among the accidents in my life, one of them was not being born in North Korea.
That's true.
Yeah.
This
Good
is
luck.
good luck.
I will.
Good night.
Thank you. Yeah, I will certainly go to sleep early because I was up very late last night and
Yeah,
very early this morning. So yeah. Good luck with everything. Enjoy putting it together and
I will.
have a good and have a and I hope you get top marks. Yeah.
I have to.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.